Let me start with something most documentaries skip. When World War II broke out, farmers didn't just grow food for the war effort. They were forced into brutal, calculated decisions that determined who ate, who starved, and which agricultural traditions survived into the modern world. This wasn't romantic farming, this was triage. Across Europe, Britain, parts of the Soviet Union, and even North America, farmers had to decide which crops deserved land, labour, seed, and protection, and which would be left to disappear. Those decisions were made under rationing, fuel shortages, labour drafts, bombing, occupation, and collapsing supply chains. If you're interested in survival history, this is one of the clearest real-world case studies of applied resilience under pressure. What makes this topic valuable is that these decisions weren't ideological. They were practical, ruthless, and based on yield, calories, storage life, and labour efficiency. Farmers were no longer growing what they preferred or what tradition dictated. They were growing what kept people alive. Why calories per acre became the ultimate survival metric. The single most important factor in crop survival during World War II was calorie density relative to land use. Governments and agricultural ministries pushed farmers toward crops that delivered the highest caloric return per acre with the least input. Potatoes, wheat, barley, oats, sugar beets, and turnips survived almost everywhere because they could feed humans directly or be redirected to livestock efficiently. Crops with low calorie output or luxury status, like certain fruits, flowers, or specialty vegetables, were often abandoned entirely. British farmers provide one of the clearest examples. During the Dig for Victory campaign, land previously used for grazing or ornamental farming was converted to potatoes and cereals. Potatoes dominated because they produced more calories per acre than bread grains and required fewer milling steps. This is a lesson modern survivalists still apply. When land or resources shrink, calorie efficiency beats variety. You know, labour shortages killed certain crops outright. By 1941, millions of farmhands were in uniform. That forced farmers to really rethink crops based on labour intensity. Anything that required delicate harvesting, frequent tending, or specialised skills was, well, at risk. Crops like hops, certain fruits, and hand-picked vegetables declined sharply unless they were critical to national morale or industry. In Germany and occupied Europe, vineyards and orchards were sometimes neglected, not because they lacked value, but because pruning, harvesting and maintenance demanded skilled labour that simply wasn't available. Root crops and grains survived because they could be planted and harvested with fewer hands, sometimes using mechanised or, simplified methods. For modern application, this is a reminder that survival planning must factor labour realistically. A high-yield crop is honestly useless if you cannot maintain or harvest it with limited manpower. Why storage and shelf life decided what stayed and what vanished. Another silent killer of crops during the Second World War was poor storage viability. Farmers prioritised crops that could survive months without refrigeration, packaging or, reliable transport infrastructure. Grains, dried legumes, potatoes stored in clamps, and root vegetables kept in cellars became absolute lifelines. Crops that spoiled quickly or required constant cold storage were, phased out unless they were consumed immediately. In Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, cabbage and beets survived not just as fresh food, but really because they could be fermented or pickled, which extended their usefulness deep into winter. This wasn't tradition for tradition's sake, it was logistics. A crop that couldn't survive transport disruptions or power failures was, honestly, a liability. Today, anyone serious about food resilience should study wartime storage methods as closely as crop selection. Growing food is only half the equation. Preserving it, well, that decides whether it saves lives. Why animal feed crops were quietly protected is, well, one of those overlooked factors in history. You see, farmers didn't only grow food for people. They also protected crops that sustained their livestock, because animals could convert otherwise inedible plants into calories, fat, and fertilizer. Fodder crops like clover, hay, and certain grains managed to survive even under the most extreme pressure, because honestly, losing livestock meant losing milk, traction, manure, and of course, future breeding stock. In Britain, maintaining dairy herds was considered strategically vital, which meant, preserving grazing land and feed crops, even while human food production was expanding. This kind of balancing act really shaped post-war agriculture more than most people realize. If you're applying this historically, the lesson is clear. Food systems are interconnected. Eliminating animal support crops might boost short-term calories, but it can destroy long-term sustainability. Governments issued all sorts of directives, but, well, farmers often just ignored them when reality didn't quite match up. In those occupied territories, farmers quietly grew crops that could be hidden, consumed locally, or even traded on the black markets. Rye, potatoes, and beans were especially favoured, mainly because they were easy to conceal, and honestly quite difficult for occupying forces to monitor accurately. This tension between policy and practice explains why some crops, survived on paper but disappeared in fields. Farmers weren't defiant by nature, they were practical. Survival always outranked compliance. If you're planning for long-term food resilience, WWII agriculture teaches 3 hard rules. First, choose crops based on calories, not preference. Second, match crops to realistic labour capacity. Third, prioritise storage and preservation from the moment seeds go into the ground. A modern homesteader applying wartime logic would, favour potatoes, beans, grains and hardy vegetables before experimenting with delicate or luxury crops. WWII farmers weren't prophets or heroes. They were really problem solvers under pressure, and their choices reshaped global agriculture permanently. Understanding why certain crops survived while others vanished isn't just history. It's a blueprint forged under the harshest conditions imaginable. If this kind of deep, practical history matters to you, subscribe to Iron Age Instincts. Share this video with someone who takes survival and history seriously. And, stay sharp.